Welcome to week four. Today we're going to start discussing the English piece of the colonial world. And there might be some unexpected elements to this, and I hope that we're going to discuss some things that are new and interesting and are going to stoke more exploration or more of an interest in research on your behalf. So I want to start with this little image here, and it's traditionally called by art historians the Old Plantation. And any of you who have any knowledge of art history know that this is what one would call a piece of primitive art or folk art. It's very flat. There isn't really much of a sense of depth, or if there is, it's kind of undermined by the fact that perspective isn't achieved. At the same time, though, it's also very pleasing. We have the beautiful sailing vessel on the river, and we have these little buildings here getting kind of smaller and smaller, achieving maybe some effective perspective until you get up to the great house itself. And that sits very pleasingly on a hill surrounded by vineyards and trees, flying birds. It looks like a real little piece of early American paradise. And to me, images such as this were what influenced my desire to become a historian when I was actually a really tiny kid. As in, like, around 4 years old, I started becoming interested in this sort of material and found it very compelling and very charming. Um, at the same time, pulling apart a piece of folk art such as this to get at a more authentic and definitely less pleasing, more sordid history of human relationships is a piece of what we're going to talk about today. This is supposed to depict the colony of Virginia. And even though this looks a lot like George Washington's Mount Vernon, it is not Mount Vernon, but there were a lot of houses that dotted hillsides along the various creeks and rivers of early Virginia. And these people who were able to settle on the coast had a tremendous advantage over other early settlers to these colonies and then people who were relative latecomers, and those advantages really kind of played out in a very sordid sort of way. So we will talk about that. I also want to point out that some of these smaller buildings here clearly are meant to be the habitations of the enslaved. I would say, especially these here, which are small and one story and have a limited number of kind of gaping windows and doors. This is a landscape of enslavement. This was a landscape that was crafted by human enslavement. It started with another labor system that, though it wasn't slavery in the eyes of the law, had some pretty awful elements to it. So it's all of these things that we're going to be talking about when we talk about the English New World. So we're starting from this perspective of a pretty colonial picture, the type of thing that might have stoked your interest as a younger person and definitely stoked mine. We're going to get to a different level of understanding, I hope, throughout the course of this week's lecture. Okay, so we moved from this idealized vision of a pretty colonial world, which, as I said, was more of an idealized version than a statement of fact, to something a good deal rougher and more violent. And the point I want to make with these images, first of all, some of you might recognize this man here by the name of Henry Morgan. I'll talk about him and his story in just a minute. And perhaps you recognize this man here, Francis Drake. If I have any alums from classic Hollywood, early America, you will recognize Drake as the person who was ostensibly portrayed by Errol Flynn in Seahawk. So that's just a little connection to the fun we had last semester, despite the shutdown of the pandemic. But the point I want to make with this slide is that we tend to think of the English colonial historical story as the one that really matters in the New World because it's what gave birth to the United States. But I do want everybody to come away from this lecture knowing that the English are relative latecomers to the colonial story. To have colonies, you need wealth, and that wealth needs to be controlled on a national scale. And that was something that England was really working toward in the 1600s, just as Spain and Portugal, and to a small certain degree, France, and then the Dutch Netherlands are ramping up in terms of uh, getting at their new resources and monetizing those resources so that they'll do something to create a strong nation. England has made a colony out of its neighbor, Ireland, through an especially brutal conquest that really repressed the Irish Catholic people. And we'll talk a little bit about their story when I talk about the Protestant Reformation. We're not quite there yet. Or actually, we are there, but the context isn't proper for it. But what we have instead is a country that can't really afford colonies. But it's also a country that's kind of in trouble because it knows that other Europeans, its enemies, most notably the Spanish and the Portuguese, are making lots and lots of money through their invasions of various parts of the globe that they are extending to, either through peaceful trade or through out and out invasion and theft of resources and the property of others. So that's a big source of concern to the English. They can't afford to do this themselves, and don't think for a second that they don't want to. They have kind of done it to Ireland. And yet at the same time, they can't compete on the same scale or the same level as the Spanish in the New World can. And the Spanish are their great enemies for a variety of reasons that have to do with religion and power, the two things, or religion and political power, royal power, the two things that really kind of rock the world of the 1600s. So what do the English do to supplement the fact that they can't afford colonies, and they also can't afford the Spanish to keep getting richer and richer and richer? They turn to something called privateering. And privateering is really nothing more than legal piracy. It's piracy that is sanctioned by your monarch or your leader. In this case, it was Queen Elizabeth I of England, who gave a number of especially skilled mariners something called a letter of marque. And that letter of marque said, I authorize you in the name of Elizabeth I or Elizabeth Regina, as she was called, to attack the shipping of our enemies. And it's simply because our enemies are going to be getting rich off of what is carried in those vessels, and we deserve to attack those vessels if we feel that it's going to help in their power struggle against us. And this is really the origin of the famous Pirates of the Caribbean. This is where they come from. They come from this great conflict between the English and the Spanish, and the fact that the English can afford ships and they are expert mariners. There is absolutely no part of the current nation of England that is more than 70 miles from the sea. So the English really know the sea, and the English know shipbuilding, and they know the skills of mariners and navigators. They are going to put these things to work to do two things: to defend their nation from possible invasion. Some of you might have heard of the Spanish Armada of 1588. That was a threat of invasion by the Spanish of the English homeland. And and it's actually pictured here. And the Spanish had these large, clunky vessels that held a lot of men and held a lot of food and held a lot of weaponry, but they were not quick, which meant that when they became the target of the quicker, faster English vessels, they were overwhelmed or intimidated or were sunk. So English mariners really put their skills to use to make up for what cannot be gained in the colonial game. Now, how do privateers, these kind of legal people, become pirates of the Caribbean? Well, there's a direct connection, and it kind of works this way. In the 16th century, privateers attacked Spanish ships as they left with looted materials from the New World. They would hang out in the many coves and around the many islands and natural harbors of the Caribbean islands. And when they saw these big, clunky Spanish vessels trying to make their way from the New World back to the Old World, they would physically attack them and often take their ship as well. And that's kind of always the goal in maritime warfare. You want to take your enemy's vessel. You don't necessarily want to sink it. That's a valuable piece of property, so you don't want to destroy it. They get extremely good at this. But as we will learn as our colonial story progresses, the Spanish and the English aren't always at war with one another. They're in a really, really bad place. In the late 16th century, 100 years later, they're in a bit of a better place. By the early 1800s, or sorry, the early 1700s, they're in kind of a good place. So these privateers who are lurking around the Caribbean become a liability to England's peace with the Spanish. They're cut off from support by their monarch. And what do? Well, they know warfare on the water. So they become pirates. They become bandits, essentially, who are waterborne. And they attack the shipping of anyone who isn't themselves, including English vessels, including Dutch and French and Spanish and Danish and Portuguese vessels. And that's really what happens during times of peace. Unless you were very clever, like this man here, Henry Morgan, who was very associated with Jamaica. He was a very successful privateer, and then peace with the Spanish deprives him of a job. And he thinks, oh no, well, I could be a pirate. And he actually does that for a good chunk of time. And when he becomes too old to really be an effective pirate leader, Henry Morgan will go legit, so to speak. And he will say to the English crown, look, I have this life of attacking vessels, both in the name of my king and in the name of my own interest, but nobody knows the Caribbean islands like I do. So I'm offering my services to you, monarch. What are you going to do? Well, what happens is the monarch makes him the royal governor of Jamaica. So he goes from being privateer to pirate, which was often a very nasty, brutish, short, and violent life, to becoming royal governor of Jamaica and dying in his bed. It's really quite a remarkable story. And for those of you who are interested in it, take a look at Henry Morgan. If you were this guy here, who was living over 100 years before Morgan, Francis Drake, your work as a privateer didn't mean that you stopped being a businessman. As you were looking for Spanish ships to attack, you were also looking for business opportunities. Drake and his associate John Hawkins get very involved in moving kidnapped, enslaved Africans across the Atlantic when the pickings on Spanish ships aren't especially good. And they also deal with tropical products in the Caribbean that they bring back to Europe to sell. So just because somebody was a privateer doesn't mean that it was all patriotism and working in the name of monarch and country. these people had complicated lives that took them into legal businesses as well as illegal ones. For the purposes of our story, this is English colonization in the 16th century. They can't really afford colonies, so attacking Spanish ships will have to do. The one colony they do have ends in disaster and mystery, and I'll talk about that with our next slide. Piracy can only sustain the English so much. There's only so much shipping that can be taken. There's only so much prudence behind such a move. There are only so many attributes to simply taking a portion of Spanish wealth instead of really countering it. So by the end of the 16th century, some English investors, with the blessing of Elizabeth I, come up with a plan for England's own first colony. In 1497, a navigator by the name of Giovanni Caboto, also known as John Cabot in English, crossed the Atlantic for Henry VII of England. And even though nothing came of this in terms of settlement, he claimed the rights to a strip of land on the east coast of North America that was the dominion of the English king. And the English king began to kind of mark New World maps, and map makers began to do the same thing with images that confirmed, at least by English standards, that this territory gave the English monarch the right to settle it. The English don't really do anything with this until the early 1580s, when, as I said, a group of investors led by the half-brothers Sir Humphrey Gilbert and Sir Walter Raleigh make an investment in a colony that will be on this strip of land. And by the way, this strip of land extends from what would be Spanish Florida, so really modern day Georgia, all the way up to the St. Lawrence River Valley, where there's an overlapping claim with the King of France. And yet neither monarch has done anything with it, neither monarch can. So the English do have this plan to start a permanent colony on what's been claimed under their name, and they want their colony to be different. And this colony is where they are going to separate themselves ideologically and as colonizers from the hateful Spanish. So here is the Spanish Empire of the La Hacienda Negra, dogs of war being put to tearing to pieces native people at the behest and to the really shocking and grotesque amusement of Spanish conquistadors. No, instead, and this is the Great Seal of Virginia, this is actually from a little bit later, but it gets the idea across. The English are going to be benevolent, kind, they're going to live in harmony with native people. It does not pan out that way. It will not pan out that way. And it doesn't pan out that way from the very, very beginning with this first colony known as the colony of Roanoke. Roanoke was planted in 1583 on the coast, on the Barrier Islands, the protected region of the Barrier Islands of North Carolina, probably somewhere. There's Roanoke Island, and there's also Ocracoke. We're not 100% sure where precisely this first colony was planted, but we have a rough idea. Several dozen English men, women, and children settle under Humphrey Gilbert's direction in this little makeshift area where they're going to start an agricultural and a mining enterprise. And you might be like, mining in eastern North Carolina? That sounds a little strange. Well, their experience with the New World is what the Spanish take out of it. And the Spanish have had tremendous success in stripping away riches from the native people and also from the land itself. So they have no reason to believe that they would have the same experience. So Roanoke is planted in 1583. It is hidden in these barrier islands because they're really trying to protect themselves from the Spanish, who are in nearby Florida and would probably not like nothing better than to wipe out a small settlement of Englishmen and women. The idea behind this colony, and it's the idea behind most colonies, is that the colony will take with it just about, or the colonists, the would-be colonists, will take with them just about everything they need to get started. So they will take prepared lumber. They will take lots and lots of food because they can't count on really recognizing the food of the New World and maintaining a well-rounded diet, which they know in the late 1600s is an important thing to do. They will take livestock and animals. They will most certainly take tools. They'll take firearms. Guns have become much more sophisticated items by the time you get to 1588, and they can be used very effectively for hunting or for protection and defense against native people, obviously, but also against the Spanish should they attack. All of these things are loaded onto vessels, left with the colony, and then the colony needs to kind of build itself using these provisions and materials. It's not something that's going to survive unless English ships come back and forth multiple times and continue to do what's called provisioning them, which is bringing them the materials that they need to live from across the other side of the sea. So Roanoke is provisioned for a period of a couple of years, and it does not have the greatest relationship with some of its Native American neighbors. With some, it's coexisting peacefully. People are learning from people, that borrowing, adding, and adapting that I've already mentioned this semester. At other times there is tension and strife. So there really is some concern about this colony's ability to protect itself. And then something happens back in England. The threat of Spanish invasion is a very real thing in the mid 1580s, and no vessels are able to leave England to reprovision this colony. So the Spanish attempt their invasion in 1588, that is the famed Spanish Armada, it is repulsed. And as quickly as can be, the investors in the Roanoke colony get together some vessels and sail to North Carolina in the most effective way they can to bring the colony what they know it's been doing without for a very long time. And what happens when they get there? They see the evidence of some attack and burning on the settlement. They see a mysterious writing on a tree, Croatoan, which is the name of a nearby group of native people who were friendly to English interests and were living peacefully with these invasive newcomers. And the colonists themselves are never found. Native people in the region say, oh, they migrated to the west. There were several attacks. A lot of them died, but the survivors just kind of went off to the west, and they're to this day living with people in the west. Who those people were was something of a mystery. They were never found. Doesn't mean they weren't there. They simply were never found by the English who were seeking them. So this becomes known as the Lost Colony of Roanoke, and it really chaps the English pretty badly that this colony was not only a disaster in terms of its ability to survive and give something back to the English monarch, but it also just completely disappeared. I mean, there was nothing left to it. So there is tremendous concern about the ability of the English to maintain a colony and what goes into creating a colony that's successful. These are questions the English are going to ask themselves for the next 20 years until they venture into trying again. When they do try again, it will be in 1606 when they'll experiment with two settlements, one settlement being to be planted in the north in Maine. Okay, big disaster, you don't do that. It was very quickly evacuated. The other to be planted farther south, but farther from the Spanish than the previous one was. Do you want me to wrap up the story of Roanoke? I know you do. Wait for it. Wait for it. Here it is. DNA evidence that linked collateral descendants of the first English settlers and native people who were rumored, in a mythical sort of sense, to have taken in the few Roanoke survivors was a match. So we pretty much know whoever survived, and apparently a handful of people did, those people did migrate to the West, did settle among native groups, intermarried with them, borrowed, added, and adapted their culture. And the mystery is really solved fairly conclusively. Science often performs very valuable services to history. And as science becomes more sophisticated and our ability to assess historical remains scientifically becomes more available and more sophisticated, we can answer or address many more historical mysteries. When the English are ready to try again, they choose a location that's further north from where Roanoke had been. They choose a location on what we know today as the Chesapeake Bay, and Chesapeake, of course, being a native term, so it was known as that of as by that term historically as well. And we can actually kind of see it here in this very old map from 1700. And the English are going to choose this protected region for their next colonial venture because obviously they remain fully aware of the fact that the Spanish are in Florida, are still their enemies, and might have played some role in the destruction of Roanoke. That piece of the puzzle remains very much unknown. So, by choosing this little protected region on a river that dumps into the Chesapeake Bay called the James River, and that's its name in honor of an English monarch, the English monarch James I. The English believe that they're going to successfully hide themselves from the Spanish in not so far away Florida, and also be able to protect and defend themselves from this particular position. This entire region that the English claimed, all the way from Georgia up to what we would call Newfoundland, is known as Virginia. Now, of course, we only associate it with one East Coast state, yet in the early 17th century, Virginia was everything that the English claimed on a map. And again, just a reminder, claiming is not the same as owning, most certainly. This is land they do not own. But putting it on a map is a very powerful way of telling other Europeans either I'm here or I plan to be here and you should not come here. The origins of the second colonial venture come from a group of investors who pull their money together and basically present a proposal to James the First and say, look, if you will just give your blessing to this venture and you will give us some military protection, you'll give us a few soldiers, or you'll allow us to have armed men at a fort to protect this venture, then we will take care of the rest. We'll assemble the settlers. We will take care of finding trade possibilities and making sure that England A has representation now in the New World in the form of a permanent settlement that it is hoped will grow and swell with the numbers of English men and women who they hope will be attracted to come here. And then we'll also provide economic incentives for the English crown to continue to colonize. So that is the state of affairs in 1606, about 13 years after the loss, 26 years, pardon, after the loss of Roanoke. No, 13. No, longer than that. 19. My apologies, folks. I'm having problems with basic arithmetic right now. And basically, the English king is going to bless this venture, and this group of merchant adventurers, who are the men who are putting up the money, provision ships, get together a bunch of physically capable young men to protect their interests and do the work of planning a colony, and sends them to this location, any location that's really sheltered, where they can hide themselves from their enemies and start to get an English toehold in the New World. And as I said before, the place that's chosen for settlement is on a little what today is called the Yorktown Peninsula, which will have great significance at the end of our semester. They settle on the Yorktown Peninsula, where they build their first of 3 forts and name it Jamestown in honor of the English monarch. Now, about the native people who are there. The native people who are there have had a long history at this point of intermixing with Europeans. So they do not fall prey to European diseases at the same rate that people 100 years before would have been felled or killed by European diseases. So they have a remarkably stable and static society in the Chesapeake region, where their paramount chief, or Powhatan, Powhatanship belongs to a powerful family headed by this man, whose name is Wohenseneca. He's also called Powhatan. For some reason, we just associate kind of the title of leadership with him. But he is the settled, consolidated, powerful leader of native peoples in the Chesapeake region, spanning from modern-day Virginia all the way up to Maryland. So we have a situation where native people have developed their own villages and lifeways. They are not nomadic. They have reliance on the Chesapeake Bay for their food, for the hunting grounds around it. They have stable and settled villages and significant numbers, and they do not die in droves, as Europeans would have described it at the time, from European diseases. So this is actually going to set up a bit of a problem when the English come to Virginia and kind of fail to quickly find their own way. At first, the Powhatans are accepting of these newcomers in their midst. They're curious about them. They wouldn't mind trading with them. They like some of the goods that the English have. But that relationship is very, very quickly going to decay. Let me say a word as well about who the first settlers are in Jamestown. The first settlers tend to fall into several categories. They are first and foremost um, servants who have come to this colony to hopefully thrive, but because they come from the poorer strata of English society, they need somebody else to pay their way and get them started. So they are obligated to serve a master, if you will, for a period of 4 to 10 years, depending on how that relationship is spelled out legally. They are people known as indentured servants. And indentured servants are European of origin, and it is very important, no matter who tells you what about this, they are not enslaved. They are not enslaved people. They are people who are still recognized as English men and women with certain rights that are spelled out in a legal contract. And that legal contract determines the kind of work you'll do, what will happen to you when the period of the contract is over, and what you can expect the master to do for you. Now, perhaps some of the confusion with their status versus the status of enslaved people of African origin comes from the fact that once a owner of your indenture, because your master owns your indenture, they don't own you, they own the legal document that governs your work. So they really kind of own your labor. Once that master gets you across the Atlantic Ocean, that person can basically do whatever they want to you. And you have very little recourse to change your situation. So there are abuses, beatings, and murders. There are terribly unfair practices meant to keep people who are still healthy at the time their indenture ends in servitude instead of getting their freedom and becoming citizens or subjects, English subjects of this new colony. So indentured servitude is rife with abuses. Indentured servants are present from the very beginning of Jamestown, and we'll talk about how they evolve as a group of people as time goes on. Another class of people are artisans, shoemakers, goldsmiths, hat makers, people who are meant to provide vital services for what the English hope to find in this colony. And what do they hope to find? Riches. Now, you might say, oh, that's so naive and that's so silly and that's based on myth, and how could they believe that? Well, they believe that because that's what the Spanish have been doing. So it's very logical in their worldview to look for riches and to believe that riches are there for the getting and that you can live in this wonderful situation in the wilderness surrounded by these riches where you just kind of live off the land and create your own estate in the wilderness and live very well. And these artisans are going to help you do that, and they're going to be able to command a good deal of money for their services because they're the only game in town. So artisans are well represented in this colony, disproportionately represented. But I have plenty of students who come to classes and believe this is because that these colonists were very naive. They're not so naive. They're riffing off what the Spanish have done, and they believe that is going to be their story too. As we now know, it's not going to be their story. The third classification of people who were in early Jamestown at its very earliest period of settlement would have been leaders and colonial administrators. So these are the youngest sons of English noblemen and women who are not going to inherit the family estate simply because they're the second or the third son. It's the first son who gets the estate. The second or third sons often have to make their way in the world as attorneys or ministers or in the military or in some line of business. And this becomes a very exciting proposition because, hey, if you come to the New World and you make a lot of money, you can kind of write your own ticket and buy your own estate. You don't need family help. you can amass your own fortune. So this is very attractive. And then every colonial environment is going to need people to administer the king's law and attempt to get the colony running smoothly through a collection of laws, basically called a compact or a charter, which spells out the laws of this colony, and then also soldiers who are going to be able to protect this colony. So this is really the first population who winds up there. It's not going to be a good mix for what they find in this colony, but hindsight is always 2020. And as said before, they were expecting their experience to be similar to the Spanish experience. It was not. From its establishment in 1607, Jamestown is pretty much a disaster. First of all, the settlers there don't find anything that immediately strikes them as being of value and of use to England's drive to grow its sources of wealth, of New World colonies. And they kind of right away give up a little bit. They refuse to work. They attempt to bully the local native people under Walhun Seneca for food, and that does not go over very well. Walhun Seneca is indeed more powerful than the English settlers are, and that results in quick and pretty profound hostilities between the two groups of people. So very quickly, this man here, by the name of John Smith, who was really an English soldier of fortune, and he's been hired by the merchant adventurers to play an administrative role in this colony. He kind of takes charge, and John Smith's life is kind of the stuff of myth in a lot of ways, and yet it's not mythic. He really did have this kind of amazing career as a soldier of fortune, and then ends up being this freelance colonial administrator who sells his abilities to the highest bidder. And in this case, it was the merchant adventurers. John Smith very quickly surveys the situation and sees that the settlers are not finding the easy riches that they wanted and are therefore going to do nothing. So he sets up a schedule of work and a production of food stuff. He is famous for his quote, "Those who do not work shall not eat." Of course, we're a household of historians here, and we have a magnet that says that on our refrigerator. I think it's actually a really good and potent reminder about the need for everybody to do their share. And he gets this colony to work, at least in terms of producing food. He also attempts to have a diplomatic relationship with the Powhatan Indians. But when there are misunderstandings or a failure to comply to requests by John Smith's standards, the situation very, very quickly turns violent. At one point, he is actually captured by Walhun Seneca and his partisans and brought into Walhun Seneca's village, and is seemingly about to have his head bashed in. He's been restrained. He's hogtied for all intents and purposes. He's on the ground and he's being menaced by people with stones and sharp weapons when a young girl seemingly comes out of nowhere and begs for his life. And that young girl is the person that we know historically, and many of us know of her thanks to Disney, even though that's really a very poor historical interpretation of her story, as Pocahontas. In actuality, her name is Matawanka. As you can see from this image of her here, yes, women wore hats like that. She's dressed as a highly stylish English woman. In this image, Matawanka, also known as Rebecca, the daughter of the High Prince of the Powhatans, and the Emperor of Virginia. That's what that says in this rondel around her. And it's John Smith interpreted this as, oh, she was madly in love with me and really liked the English and didn't want to see me killed. And therefore, she interceded to save my life. Um, First of all, John Smith's story, and John Smith wrote it down himself so he could write whatever he wanted, is filled with instances where he's about to be killed and a woman falls in love with him and begs for his life and he gets out of it. So this is kind of a common narrative arc for the way he describes his story. Historians now believe that Pocahontas, or Matawanka more appropriately, had a narrative arc of her own. That what was happening in this particular instance, where it looked like Smith was going to be killed and then somebody interceded with him, is that it was a ritual of the Powhatans that made John Smith a vassal, essentially, of the Powhatan king Wahun Seneca. And Smith, at the very same time, believes he is making a vassal of Wahun Seneca to King James I. So there's misinterpretation going on there. It's kind of comedic on this level, but of course, that level is going to get much more dire and violent and brutal. What happens to Pocahontas or Matawanka? First of all, there is no romantic relationship with these two, even though it's portrayed that way in Disney and in other highly romanticized stories. But her story is an important one, and we remember it for some good reasons. First of all, she came frequently to the English fort because she did find the English either interesting or was curious about them, or just wanted to see what they were up to. Perhaps she was even spying for her father, but she's actually quite a young girl as she's doing this. There's actually a passage in Smith's Reflections where he talks about her doing somersaults with young English servant boys, that they're all just kind of playing together and they're doing somersaults and other kinds of gymnastics within the fort. She is then kidnapped and held for ransom at a time when Smith believes the Powhatans are not playing fairly with the English. And at that time, she might have already been married to a Native American warrior. There's speculation about that. But then she is used as this bargaining chip to bring these two people together. Um, and it's one of the many times of stress between Wahun Seneca's people and the English people at the Jamestown fort. This one worked out peacefully. Many do not. Ultimately, uh, Matawanka is going to become the love interest of a young English settler by the name of John Rolfe. And he's kind of John Smith's confidant. And with Smith's blessing and with Matawanka's conversion to Christianity and the acceptance of the name Rebecca, she and Rolfe will marry, and then they will go back to England with their little 4-month-old son, a baby boy by the name of Thomas. While they are in London, Matawanka is a subject of fascination by the English. I must treat it like this exotic to be viewed in this, kind of cynical sort of way that we look at the outsider as this exhibit rather than as this human being. But it's in London that she sickens and dies, and the baby sickens as well, and he sickens without his mother and the care of his mother, but he does not die. He eventually comes back to Virginia with his father, and he becomes the father of 14 living children, all of whom intermarry with early English settlers. So, really, the first commercial families of Virginia do owe their legacy both to various English families and then also to the whole network of Powhatans through Matawanka. And this tragic story of cultural mixing. Smith, at one point, is badly injured in what was presumed to be a gunpowder accident. And the question that has always made historians scratch their heads is, was it really an accident? He is hated because he makes the English work and work hard. He's hated at times because he will not just kind of ruthlessly and without cause attack Powhatan settlements and storehouses and take food for the English that the English want. Nor will he always, he often does, but he will not always back up Englishmen who are going to attack Native people or pick fights with Native people because they want their food or their resources and they can't get them easily. So this image here shows a lot of Smith's New World adventures. Here's the dance in which he is saved by Pocahontas. Here he is encountering by his standard, a very uncooperative Wallen Seneca. Here's Wallen Seneca's village. Here's a map of Virginia. Here is Smith with Wallen Seneca's successor, a chief by the name of Opechancanough, who Smith tells us lived to be 101 years old. And Opechancanough does not take the same approach to English settlement that his brother Wallen Seneca did. He loathes the English. He tries numerous times to push them back into the sea, and he almost succeeds. But each time this happens, the English get more and more bitter and more homicidal toward their Native American neighbors. We first start to see this as early as 1610, when Smith is sent back to England to nurse his wounds from the gunpowder accident, and the colony, relieved that he is gone, refuses to do hard work, picks fights with the Powhatans, and as a result, starves. This is called the starving time in the colony's history. Basically, relationships have deteriorated so badly between the English settlers and the nearby Powhatan Indians that the English just simply cannot leave the fort to grow food for themselves or to hunt. They are restricted to the fort. They run out of food. It's an especially harsh winter. And we know from this image here, the image of this skull, that they had to resort to cannibalism and to eat the pre-dead. This is an artifact that comes out of excavations of the Jamestown fort that is, like many artifacts we'll see this semester, very, very touching. It belonged to a 14-year-old girl, and here's a reconstruction of what she might have looked like. Most likely a servant. She's been given the name Jane of Jamestown, and her skull was found in a trash dump. So we know that life was very, very cheap in this colony, especially if you were a servant. And what's significant about her skull is the fact that it was marked with knives and it was bashed in here, and it's completely missing one side of the skull, which you can kind of see through your ability to see through the image here. And that was cleanly cut by a sharp tool, which means somebody was deliberately trying to get into her brain and eat her brain, which would have been one of the more nourishing and palatable parts of a human being. I have a 14-year-old daughter, and this girl was, the same age as my own child, and came to the New World as a servant, lived life in starvation, fear, and horror, and had her remains, when she was gone and when she was no longer useful as food, simply dumped in the trash. What follows after the starving time of 1610 is a period where the colony is simply a disaster. All through the 16 teens, um, are there are horrible conflicts between the settlers and native people. The colony is unproductive. It's not making any money. Settlers are dying in droves, not just from hostilities with native people, but also because disease is running roughshod. It's kind of the classic virgin soil epidemic, which we're really seeing with the novel coronavirus right now, that is exposing New World people to microbes and possibly to poisoned water that they were unaware of due to naturally occurring arsenic, that make this colony just kind of a perpetual shambles. They're about to pack up after the starving time, and a few settlers are going to try to make their way back to England when a fresh boatload, several fresh boatloads of settlers arrive and save the colony. Save it in terms of its numbers and the number of people who can work, but it's still long from salvation. And part of the reason is it really has not found a resource that is of value to England or to other Europeans, that can make supporting this colony tenable. Because you really have to have some resource, something that's worth money, something that's valuable to someone to make a colony work. Otherwise, there really isn't a whole lot of reason to have a colony in the 16th, 17th, or 18th centuries. John Rolfe, that husband of Pocahontas, is going to have the solution. And that solution is this plant here, called Nicotiana virginiensis. Have pretty little flowers and kind of nice big leaves, also known as just the tobacco, the variant that grows best in North America. So Rolfe encounters this on a Spanish Caribbean island. This form of Nicotiana, which is the proper Latin term for tobacco, doesn't grow especially well there, but he brings some seedlings and young plants back to Virginia, and it thrives in that soil. It grows beautifully, and here we see kind of an image from real life. It's actually from Colonial Williamsburg, of a tobacco field with young plants in it. And this becomes a pretty lucrative crop for the Virginians. The Virginians have finally found something that's going to make them money, but it comes with some real liabilities. And those liabilities are this. First of all, you have to clear a lot of land to plant tobacco. And it's really important to note that when settlers came from anywhere in Europe, they didn't come to a countryside that they recognized. The countryside was not what we would call clear cut. There aren't just fields that you can plant crops on and expect them to grow and expect them to produce. There are trees everywhere. There's brush. That is hard, laborious work, getting rid of that. As you can see from this early woodcut, there are stumps, tree stumps, in this tobacco planting field. And that's because you would just cut the tree down as quickly as you could to get some sunlight in, grow the crop, let this stump rot a little bit, and then it's a lot easier to remove it eventually. But you would do the quickest thing possible, which would not include what's called grubbing stumps, in order to get that crop started and underway. In addition, tobacco is a great thief of nitrogen. All plant matter requires nitrogen, and plants use it at different rates. And tobacco is especially punitive on the soil. So what happens is that you can kind of open up this field for tobacco cultivation, and it will produce tobacco for a few years. But then you have to let it go back to just weeds and volunteer plant life, something you call farm fallow, to get the nitrogen back in the soil, or else you can't use it for tobacco anymore. which means you have to then break in a new tobacco field. And so tobacco requires all of this room and all of this fresh soil, which means that, and keep in mind, this is north on this map. It's shown a little cattywampus, if you will, because that was the choice of the artist. Planting tobacco in Virginia requires new land after new land after new land to be broken in for farming. What's the logical consequence of this? Two things. First of all, the people who arrive earliest in Virginia and survive these really horrible things like the starving time and the decade after the starving time, end up being some of the richest people in the colony. With tobacco, they gobble up all of this coastal area around the Chesapeake Bay and the Chesapeake Bay's many little rivers. Why do they do that? Because then they can just take their tobacco crop, throw it on some rafts, bring it down to Jamestown where it can be shipped out to England, and they can get their money for it. So they become very wealthy indeed if they survive the starving time. And within their company are a few indentured servants who outlived their terms of indenture, started their own farms, and became wealthy too. Just as an interesting postscript, in 1619, you see the first enslaved African people brought to Virginia for sale. The English don't really know how to treat these people from Africa. They know they're different, but they don't have a system of enslavement in England. So they're kind of treated like indentured servants. You do your work and you work hard, but then at the end of a period of time, you are freed. And one of the wealthiest of these early planters was a man by the name of, he had come to the colony as Antonio. His name was Anthony Johnson, or he takes the name Anthony Johnson. He starts his own plantation up here in Maryland, becomes quite a wealthy farmer, and he himself owns slaves and indentured servants. This is a fairly small window of time in Virginia's history where a person of color who comes to the colony enslaved can actually hope to aspire to one of these positions of prominence in the colony. And yet it does happen, telling us that the bias and the bigotry and the racism that accompany human enslavement did not necessarily have to be. The point I'm making, though, also with this image is that the people who are there the earliest get the richest. And if you come a little bit later, you might have some success as a tobacco farmer too, but guess what? You're not going to have access to water to move your crop. You're going to have to pay one of these wealthy earlier settlers to do it for you, which means that the farther out you go, the poorer you tend to be, or the more money it costs to create a tobacco farm that is viable. And also the more pressure you are putting on Native people. During times of severe stress and crisis between Native people and Englishmen, it's going to be these people in these frontier regions who are doing the same backbreaking labor that everybody is, but seeing a lot less for their efforts, who are going to be coming up immediately in conflict with Native people and be in the most dangerous situations. This is a persistent story throughout 17th century Virginia until you get to the 1670s. This man here, who I think kind of looks like a kind of looks like a Cheshire cat, is a royal governor of Virginia, a man by the name of William Berkeley. And Berkeley came to the colony from a wealthy English family and is deputized with making the colony run. And because he's well connected, he is one of those earlier planters who makes a lot of money by having these coastal connections to moving tobacco out easily and quickly and earning money. So Berkeley is not only a prominent early leader, he's a very wealthy man. He has a huge tobacco plantation where he has scads of indentured servants and has also purchased some enslaved Africans. And he is loved in the colony by other wealthy planters, and he's not liked so much by everybody else. These men kind of remind me for you fans of Lord of the Rings. It's when Gandalf says to Saruman that Sauron does not share power, and that's what Berkeley and these other first come, first serve wealthy planters are in this colony. They seize the power, they run it pretty much with an iron fist. They rule this colony with kind of arbitrary power, and they are not looking to take care of the small tobacco farmers on the frontiers. If anything, they want to retain, to the best of their ability, good relationships with native people. Now, that's not through altruism, that's not to be kind, that's not to be fair. That's because they want to be able to trade with English goods with native people and have native people bring them things that might be desirable back in England, and to also kind of keep harmony in the frontier regions. As small farmers move out west, they put more and more pressure on these would-be trade partners of William Berkeley and his colonial associates, and Berkeley refuses to do anything about it when Indians attack these small farmers. Enter this cousin of Berkeley, a man by the name of Nathaniel Bacon. Bacon is young and arrogant. As you can see, he has what my mother would have said, like a smug puss on his face. He feels that he's an important man in this world, and he feels that he, being connected to William Berkeley, should be an important man in Virginia colony. So he emigrates to the colony and expects that he's going to live well and he's going to be a leader. And that is not the case. Berkeley and his friends have pretty much tied up power. And it's like, okay, Nathaniel Bacon, you're welcome to settle here, but don't expect to immediately aspire to the upper echelons of leadership. Nathaniel Bacon is young, he's smart, he's ambitious, and he craves power. So he thinks, okay, what can I do to change the situation? How can I wrest power from these wealthier men? This is what he does. He fans out into the countryside, telling small farmers that he has their best interests at heart. And if they want to stop these attacks from native people, they should support him, and they should put pressure on the colonial leadership in Jamestown to protect them over Native American trading allies. He forms an army, and this army consists of small farmers, ex-indentured servants, ex-enslaved people of color who are now farmers in the colony. Will also support Nathaniel Bacon, and also have kind of powerful friendships with other small white farmers who are in their same situation. This army will march on Jamestown and demand reform. Berkeley and his associates are going to get out of there as quickly as they possibly can. Bacon and his associates are going to burn Jamestown. And then, for a variety of reasons, this rebellion is going to fall apart. Bacon doesn't emerge as quite the leader that he seemed to be, and he is going to then be apprehended and die in jail. He basically dies of something called dysentery, which is pretty much pooping yourself to death. A very inglorious way to go. And William Berkeley and his associates are going to be restored to their rightful position. But they are shattered and they are scared about what has just happened. Oh my goodness, we've had class warfare with all of these small, poor farmers, I don't mean physically small, I mean small in terms of their land holdings and their wealth, rising up against the great men. How can we keep this from happening? How they keep it from happening is something very, very cynical. And that is to, first of all, limit the number of indentured servants who can come from England to Virginia. Bring over fewer indentured servants, because then few of them are going to live and few of them are going to expect to have their share of the colony after their indenture is over. They were the ones who really sided with Bacon and created these problems. In addition, Berkeley and his associates and the leadership generation after them are going to start to create laws that separate Black and white in this colony. Prior to Bacon's rebellion, people of color of African origin and servants and poor farmers were in very much the same position. They were held in contempt by colonial leadership, but they also lived together, worked together, worshiped together, intermarried, and had relationships with one another, had children with each other, had friendships with each other. This is perceived as profoundly dangerous and threatening by those who have managed to hold on to their power in the wake of Bacon's rebellion. So how do you deal with this situation? Through the evolution of racist laws and practices. Make it harder for a person of African origin who was purchased as a slave to ever get their freedom. Put laws onto their lives, governing their movements and adding stiff penalties for violations of those movements, making their state permanent rather than something that looked more like indentured servitude, and very deliberately not doing this to whites. So basically, the wealthy men of the colony singled out people of African origin for laws based on race, while simultaneously telling the white farmers and settlers, oh, you may not be wealthy as us, you may not have your power, but you know what? You're also not enslaved, and maybe someday you'll amass enough money to own one of your former friends. Maybe you'll amass enough money to own a lot of them, and then you can be a big and powerful man in this colony. So they simultaneously created these laws with racial origins meant to define what an enslaved person was, and then also held out to even the poorest of white European farmers the possibility for upward mobility because they were white and not enslaved.